The canyon was burning. Not metaphorically. The actual rock was burning. The Vethka incendiary rounds had baked the sandstone so long that the minerals inside had finally ignited, and now the walls of the ravine glowed in streaks of orange and pale blue, like something between a bonfire and a fever dream. Sergeant First Class Darian Cole had stopped noticing the heat 20 minutes ago, which he knew was a bad sign. He'd read once that you stopped noticing extreme temperatures right around the time your body gave up arguing with them. He pressed his back against the glowing rock and counted his ammunition. 11 rounds in the carbine. One fragmentation grenade, the pin slightly bent from when he'd landed wrong jumping the eastern ridge. His sidearm, 14 rounds. A combat knife. The emergency beacon he was not going to activate because activating it would tell the Vethka exactly where he was, and the only reason he was still breathing was that they didn't know exactly where he was. He listened. The Vethka moved like water through a cracked floor. You didn't hear them coming so much as you heard the absence of other sound, the insects going quiet, the hot wind pulling back, the rocks settling wrong. Cole had been fighting them for 11 months across 3 continents, and he had learned that silence was their first weapon. Their second weapon was numbers. Their third weapon was the absolute, biological certainty that they were apex predators, and everything that walked on 2 legs was food with opinions. He had 37 confirmed kills. They had a word for him. He'd been told by an interpreter at Firebase Kessler before Firebase Kessler stopped existing. The word translated roughly as the one that broadcasts. He hadn't understood it then. He understood it now. 17 of them crested the south ridge. Cole moved before they fully appeared, not toward cover, but laterally, east along the canyon floor, using the burning wall as backlight to mess up their thermal imaging. The Vethka used heat signatures to track. He was banking on the canyon itself being so hot that he registered as nothing more than a smear in the noise. He'd done it twice before. The first time it had saved his life. The second time it had merely delayed the problem. He ran low and quiet, boots finding purchase on the loose shale through muscle memory alone, the carbine tucked tight against his chest. Behind him, he heard the distinctive 3-beat vocal pattern the Vethka used for tactical coordination, a sound like someone snapping wet bones, and he counted the gaps between snaps and translated them into movement vectors, the way a musician reads time signatures. They were flanking, good, flanking took time. He reached the canyon's eastern branch and ducked into the shadow of a collapsed overhang. The rock above him was cool, hadn't caught yet. He pressed himself flat and watched the main group move through where he'd been standing 15 seconds prior. 17 of them, moving in their characteristic hexagonal formation, the outer 6 acting as perimeter, the inner 11 carrying the shock weapons that turned human nerve tissue into static. He did not let himself think about what those weapons had done to the soldiers he'd arrived in this canyon with. The flanking pair appeared on the ridge above him. He saw them clearly in the canyon glow, silhouetted against the burning sky, tall, 7 feet at the shoulder, their bodies oriented along a horizontal axis the way Earth's great predatory cats oriented, though the Vethka stood upright when they chose to. Their sensory clusters, the branching filament structures that humans had taken to calling antlers, though they were nothing of the sort, were spread wide and quivering. Hunting posture, they were reading the air. Cole breathed through his nose, small sips. His instructor at Sear had taught him that olfactory suppression was a myth. If a predator was close enough, it would smell you regardless. But that breath control changed your own biochemistry in ways that bought seconds, and seconds were the whole game. The closer of the 2 Vethka paused directly above him, its weight shifting on the ridge. It was reading something. Cole watched its filament antlers cycle through 3 tracking positions and then go still. It was looking directly down. Cole didn't move, didn't breathe. Let the burning canyon make him into noise. The filament cycled once more. The Vethka turned its head, the massive, triangular head with its 4 paired eyes arranged in a band around the skull, and made a low sound to its partner, a single down-pitched click that Cole's operational vocabulary told him meant, "Nothing here." They moved on. He breathed. He didn't know he was being watched, not yet. 40 meters above the canyon, hovering in a stealth configuration that rendered it invisible to every human sensor currently deployed in this theater of operations, a Vethka observation vessel the size of a city bus sat motionless in the burning air. Aboard it, 6 individuals were watching the feeds from 12 perimeter drones that had been tracking the lone human since he'd first appeared in the canyon 26 minutes ago. 5 of those individuals were Imperial Guard, sworn to the protection of the 6th. The 6th was Sarath Vekon, second daughter of the 3rd Meridian House, junior emissary to the Human Compliance Theater, and she was watching the thermal display with an expression that none of her guards had seen on her face before. It was the expression of someone whose understanding of a thing has just cracked open and is showing an entirely different interior. "He saw the flanking pair," she said. Guard Captain Oven, who stood at her left shoulder the way he'd stood at every left shoulder she'd occupied since she was 3 years old, said nothing for a moment. Then, "The thermals from the canyon wall create a diffraction pattern. He may have calculated from the patrol group's formation that a flanking element would be positioned." "He counted the snap cadence," Sarath said. "Watch his movement timing. He moved before the flanking pair reached their position. He translated the tactical call." Silence in the observation cabin. Oven leaned forward and reviewed the footage. He was quiet for a long time. "No human has demonstrated the ability to parse Vethka field communication before," he finally said. He said it carefully, the way he said things when the information was dangerous. "This one has," Sarath said. She pulled up his service record on the tactical display. "Sergeant First Class Darian Cole, United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached on loan to the newly formed Human Vethka Defense Coordination Force," which was a name that had been invented to obscure the fact that it was a unit specifically designed to observe and document Vethka tactical behavior rather than actually fight it. Cole had apparently not received this part of the memo. In 11 months of deployment, he had single-handedly modified, refined, and occasionally completely ignored his unit's documentation mandate in favor of direct engagement with Vethka patrol units. 37 confirmed kills. The number sat in the record like an accusation. The Vethka Empire had been on Earth for 6 years. In that time, they had cataloged and assessed the human military with the same methodical thoroughness they'd applied to the 17 other species they'd brought under compliance. The general consensus of the Imperial Assessment Corps, a consensus that had never been seriously challenged until approximately 25 minutes ago, was that humans were a high-aggression, low-coordination species with exceptional individual physicality but critically limited strategic capacity. They were dangerous the way a river was dangerous, powerful in a straight line, easy to redirect. Sarath had written 3 reports questioning this assessment. They had been filed, acknowledged, and set aside. She watched Darian Cole press himself flat under the overhang and hold so still that the Vethka hunters literally walked above him and detected nothing. The guards behind her were murmuring. She heard the word for wager exchange hands. The Empire's court culture ran on it, the way court cultures always ran on the thing that let people pretend randomness was control. Who would reach him first? How many shots he'd fire before they took him? Whether he'd use the emergency beacon. "He won't use the beacon," Sarath said aloud. She hadn't meant to say it. Guard Second Preth looked up from his private wager transaction. "Emissary." "The emergency beacon. He won't activate it." She was still watching the thermal feed. "He knows it would give away his position. He's calculated that his concealment is worth more than the probability of extraction." Humans are not capable of that level of. He's been doing exactly that level of calculation for 26 minutes, she said, and something in her voice made Preth stop talking. On the thermal feed, Cole came out from under the overhang and began moving again. Cole had a problem. The problem was not the 17 Vethka in the main canyon. Those he could manage, or at least delay, through the terrain features he'd spent the last 20 minutes cataloging. The problem was not his ammunition count, which was thin but not yet critical. The problem was not even the badly bent grenade pin, though that was definitely going to become a problem in the next few minutes. The problem was the command class unit he'd spotted at the canyon's northern mouth 12 minutes ago. Command class Vethka were different from standard hunters. They were larger, for one, nearly 9 feet, carrying the extra mass of the command sensory organ that ran along their dorsal ridge like a second spine. But the real difference was cognitive. Standard Vethka operated on instinct overlaid with tactical training, the way a well-drilled soldier operated on training overlaid with instinct. Command class Vethka operated on something Cole could only describe as genuine tactical intelligence, adaptive, predictive, capable of modeling multiple enemy behavior simultaneously. This one had been still for 12 minutes, which meant it was thinking. Cole did not like being thought about. He needed to change the game before the command class finished its model. The thing about command class thinking was that it was thorough but slow. The extra cognitive load of running multiple simulations required something close to patience, and patience looked, from the outside, like stillness. Cole had once watched a command class unit spend 45 minutes completely motionless before it deployed its patrol in a configuration that had killed 8 members of Bravo Company in less than 90 seconds. The lesson he'd taken from that day was, disrupt the model before it finishes. Don't let them think, force reaction. He pulled the grenade from his vest. The pin was bent at roughly 20 degrees, functional, but the pull would be rough. He wrapped 2 fingers under it and rehearsed the motion without pulling, a habit from an instructor named Sergeant Mace who'd been dead for 7 years, and whose voice Cole still heard in high-pressure situations, telling him never surprise yourself with your own equipment. He looked up. The canyon had 2 natural acoustic reflectors, the bulging outcrop on the west wall about 60 meters north, and the place where the east and north branches met in a kind of stony throat that concentrated sound and sent it in 3 directions simultaneously. If he threw the grenade into that throat, the blast would echo in a pattern that would make the Vethka patrol believe the attack was coming from the west while Cole moved north and east. The command class was between him and the northern mouth. That was acceptable. Everything that ever mattered was between Cole and where he needed to be. He gave himself 3 seconds, the exact length of time Sergeant Mace used to say you should spend on the decision before the decision had to make itself, and then he stood up and threw. The grenade cleared the overhang, caught the angle he'd calculated, bounced off the canyon wall precisely as intended, and detonated in the throat junction with a sound that the burning rock turned into something resembling artillery. The west wall lit up in secondary flash. The Vethka patrol, exactly as he'd mapped their formation, pivoted west. The command class turned north, orienting to what it would have calculated as the most probable human egress. It was right, Cole was already there. He came around the burning outcrop at a dead run, carbine up, and the command class was exactly where the calculus said it would be, 9 feet of thinking predator with its sensory ridge fully extended, processing the explosion, not yet recalibrated to immediate threat. Cole shot it twice. Center mass, which on a Vethka command class was the dorsal organ, the engine of all that intelligence. The first round disrupted. The second round ended. He kept running. He was through the northern mouth before the hunting pair even turned. Behind him he heard the sounds that Vethka made when they found a command class dead. He'd heard it 3 times before. It wasn't grief, exactly. It was more like the sound a precision instrument makes when it discovers the measurement was wrong, a kind of system-level reorientation, costly and dissonant. He ran north. In the observation cabin, nobody spoke for almost 30 seconds. Sarath Vekon was the one who finally broke it, and she broke it with a single word. Replay. Owen cued the footage from the grenade throw onward. They watched Cole clear the northern mouth. They watched the command class drop. He anticipated the command class's positioning from its cognitive pattern, Preth said slowly. He was the fastest thinker among her guards, which was why she kept him close despite his habit of talking too much in precisely the situations that required quiet. He reverse-modeled what the command class was modeling. He predicted its prediction. He did, Sarath said. That's, Preth searched for the word, that's not documented. No, she agreed, it is not. She was quiet for a moment, watching Cole's thermal signature move north through the canyon system, quick and deliberate, already adapting his route to the patrol redeployment her drones were tracking in real time. 6 years. 6 years of Imperial assessment reports, 6 years of compliance frameworks, 6 years of the Empire treating humanity as a species that needed to be managed rather than understood. Sarath had grown up on those reports. She'd studied them at the Meridian Academy, had written careful, politely worded critiques of their methodology, had been told by instructors she respected that her concerns were noted, but that the data was the data. The data was not the data. The data was a model, and the model was wrong, and she had been saying so for 3 years, and the Empire had been too confident in its own assessment machinery to listen. She thought about the way Cole had breathed under that overhang, the way he hadn't moved, the way he'd read silence and turning footsteps and bone-snap cadences and made them into a map in real time. She thought about the soldiers the Empire had assessed as low coordination. She thought about what coordination actually meant, and whether it looked different from the inside than it did from the orbit. Owen, she said. Emissary. I want a direct audio channel to the human. The cabin went very quiet. Emissary, Owen said carefully, that is. I'm aware of what it is. Open the channel. Cole heard the voice in his left ear. He nearly shot the canyon wall. The voice came through the tactical comms frequency, not his comms unit specifically, but the frequency itself, which meant something was broadcasting at a power level that could reach any human receiver in range. The voice was speaking English, which was either a coincidence or not. His money was on not. It said, Sergeant Cole, I am not your enemy. I am watching you, and I want you to know that I am watching you, and that I am not your enemy. He kept running. You can respond or not respond, the voice continued. It was a low voice, precise in its consonants in the way of someone speaking a language they'd learned formally rather than lived in. I will tell you what I know. There are 11 surviving hunters from the patrol group in the main canyon. They've reconfigured from the flanking formation to a pursuit column. They will reach the northern exit in approximately 4 minutes. The canyon system you are entering has 2 viable egress routes, northwest toward the plateau or due north through the thermal vent field. The plateau route has 3 Vethka forward observation posts. The thermal vent route has none. He slowed just slightly, not from trust, from calculation. You've been tracking me, he said. He had no idea if his comms would transmit on the same frequency. Apparently they did. For 29 minutes, the voice said, since you entered the canyon. Why? A pause, not a hesitation, something that felt more deliberate. Because I have been watching you fight and I do not fully understand what I am seeing, and in my experience, when you do not understand something, the correct response is to pay closer attention. Cole made the turn north toward the thermal vent field. He told himself it was purely tactical. He wasn't sure he was right. What don't you understand? He said. Many things, the voice said. But most urgently, you killed a command-class unit alone. I want to know how you knew where it would be standing." "I thought about what it was thinking," Cole said. "Then I thought about where something would stand if it was thinking that." The silence on the line lasted long enough that he thought the connection had dropped. "Then, yes, that is what I thought you had done. I needed to hear you say it." The thermal vent field was exactly what it sounded like. A stretch of volcanic geology about 2 kilometers across where ground heat pushed through in intermittent columns, turning the terrain into a chessboard of hot zones and cold corridors that shifted every 4 to 8 minutes as the venting cycled. For the Vethka, whose thermal tracking was their primary sensory mode, it was essentially a whiteout. For Cole, who'd grown up navigating by touch and sound in training exercises that Ranger School called character building and everyone else called hazing, it was navigable. Not comfortable, not safe, but navigable. He moved through it the way his seer instructor, a different instructor, a woman named Captain Flores who'd been held in a Vethka compliance camp for 9 days and come home different but not broken, had taught him to move through any sensory denial environment, which was, slowly, incrementally, using the information each step gave you to build the model for the next step. The voice came back. "You are in the vent field." "I noticed." The pursuit column stopped at the field's edge. "They will not enter." "I know. You knew before I told you. It's why I came this way." Another of those deliberate silences. Cole was starting to read them the way he read the bone snap cadences. They had content, those silences. They weren't empty. "I want to meet you," the voice said. Cole stepped over a hot crack in the ground, felt the heat on his face, kept moving. "Under what terms?" "Under whatever terms make you willing to come." "Who are you?" "My name is Sarath Vekon. I am second daughter of the 3rd Meridian House and junior emissary to this theater of operations." A pause. "I understand those words probably mean nothing to you." "They mean your imperial court," Cole said. "They mean you have authority and you want something from me, and you have the power to offer things in exchange." "Yes," she said, "precisely yes." "What do you want?" "I want to tell my government that their assessment of your species is wrong. I need something more than my own observations and 3 years of politely ignored reports. I need a witness." Another pause, and this one had a different quality to it, more personal. "I think I need you to be seen." Cole came out the north side of the vent field. The plateau stretched ahead of him, empty and wind-scoured and dark, the burning canyon 2 kilometers behind. He stopped and looked at the sky. "I've been fighting your people for 11 months, he said. "I know." 37. "I know. And you want me to walk into a meeting with the Imperial Court." "Not the full court," she said. "My observation vessel, myself and my guards, 6 individuals total." Cole stood in the wind and thought about the command class unit's modeling, and the way it had calculated right and still died, because it hadn't calculated for what it had never seen before. He thought about what Captain Flores had looked like when she came back from the compliance camp, not broken, not anymore, but carrying something that made her eyes different, like a door that was slightly off its hinges and could never be rehung precisely right. He thought about Firebase Kessler. "Are the people in this theater the people who make compliance policy?" he asked. "No," Sarath said. "Those people are in the inner meridian, 40 light-years from here. I am not one of them. I am one of the people who is sent to places like this to represent that policy, and I am telling you that the policy is built on a fundamentally flawed assessment, and I have been trying to change it through the official channels for 3 years, and the official channels are not working." The wind was cold up on the plateau. Cole hadn't noticed until now. "So what are you going to do?" he asked. "I am going to bring the evidence to them directly, which means I need the evidence." A pause that had the quality of someone choosing words carefully. "You are the evidence." She dropped the vessel into the plateau's eastern bowl, an hour before dawn. Cole came out of the dark slowly, with his hands where the crew could see them and his carbine slung across his back in the non-threatening carry. He'd done a lot of things in his military career that required suppressing every survival instinct he'd developed. This one required suppressing them all simultaneously. He managed it by doing what he always did, which was to make it a tactical problem and solve the tactical problem, and the tactical problem was, walk toward the ship without getting shot. He walked toward the ship. The landing ramp was down. 2 Vethka guards flanked it, Imperial Guard, distinguished from standard hunters by the color pattern on their sensory filaments, which ran silver gold rather than the tan brown he was used to seeing in field units. They were larger than any Vethka he'd encountered in combat, which was saying something. They watched him approach with the four-band gaze of their species, all 8 eyes tracking independently, and Cole met the gaze as steadily as he could and kept walking. He made himself think about Sergeant Mace, about the way Mace used to say that the only thing between you and being afraid was your job. Do your job and fear has nowhere to stand. He did his job. He walked up the ramp. Sarath Vekon was smaller than he'd expected. The Vethka ranged from 7 to 9 feet and moved along their horizontal axis by preference, but she stood upright in the human fashion, or near enough, and she was toward the lower end of the size range. Her filament antlers ran a deep bronze color that he'd never seen on a field unit. Her four-band eyes were a shade of pale gold that caught the ship's interior light and held it. She was wearing what he recognized from Imperial cultural briefings as formal emissary attire, layered in the clan colors of House Vekon, which were deep green and silver. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Behind her, the 5 guards watched everything. The one at her left shoulder, the largest one, the one whose posture made it clear he'd been at this post for a very long time, had his eyes on Cole's carbine and had not moved his hand from his own weapon. "Thank you for coming," Sarath said. Cole looked at her. He thought about all the things he could say, about the assessment reports and the compliance framework and Firebase Kessler, and 37 confirmed kills, and the soldiers who hadn't made it out of that canyon. He thought about how much anger he was carrying and how little it was going to accomplish here. "You saved my life tonight," he said instead. "I told you which way to run," she said. "You would have figured it out." "Maybe." But the certainty helped. She tilted her head, a gesture he'd never seen a Vethka make, and he realized after a moment that she'd learned it from human cultural briefings, the same way he'd learned to read their snap cadences from his own briefings. They were, both of them, doing the same thing, reaching across. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She talked for 3 hours. Not to him, or not only to him. She was building a record, he understood eventually. The ship's internal systems were logging everything, and she was constructing, in real time, the argument she'd been trying to make to the Empire for 3 years in the form of a dialogue with the thing the Empire had told her didn't exist. A human who had fought the Vethka not through aggression or desperation, but through understanding. She asked him to describe how he'd read the snap cadences. He described it. She asked him to walk through the command class engagement. He walked through it. She asked him about Firebase Kessler, and he stopped, and she said, "You don't have to," and he said, "No, you need it." And he described Firebase Kessler in the kind of flat, factual language that people use when they've processed something past the point where emotion is accessible, and all that's left is the shape of the event. The large guard at her left shoulder, she'd introduced him as Oven, guard captain, 30 years in service, had moved his hand away from his weapon somewhere around the 2nd hour. Cole had noticed but not acknowledged. The assessment report classifies human tactical decision-making as reactive rather than predictive, Sarath said at one point. She had a tablet in her hands, human style, which surprised him until she explained that the Vethka had been studying human interface technology since the first contact, partly for intelligence purposes, and partly because some elements were genuinely better. The basis for this classification is engagement data from the first 18 months of contact operations. When we didn't know what we were fighting, Cole said. Precisely. The assessment was built on data from a period during which humans were experiencing their first contact with a hostile non-human species. The assessment treated that period's behavior as representative of human baseline capacity. It is, by any reasonable standard, the worst possible data set for establishing a behavioral baseline. We were learning, Cole said. You were learning, she said. The Empire was not accounting for the learning because the Empire's model of your species did not include significant adaptive capacity. She set the tablet down. But you did not merely learn their tactics. You learned their language. You reverse-engineered the cognitive structure of a command-class tactical mind well enough to predict its specific positional choice in a specific high-stress engagement. That is not adaptation. That is something else. It's empathy, Cole said. She looked at him. It's a human thing, he said. We don't have a word for what you all call it, but for us it's empathy. The ability to model another mind well enough to feel where it is before you see it. He thought about how to explain this. We do it to each other constantly. We do it to animals. It's how we domesticated wolves. We started reading them. I just extended it. Owen spoke for the first time. His voice was deep, subvocal in the way of large Vethka, and his English was rougher than Sarath's but workable. You felt where the commander would stand. Yes, Cole said. That is, Owen stopped. He seemed to be making a decision. I was at the assessment review in the third year of contact operations. I wrote a supplementary observation suggesting that human unpredictability was being underweighted as a tactical factor. It was included as an appendix, and no one read it. Cole looked at the guard captain, this enormous creature who had spent 30 years standing at a young emissary's shoulder, watching empires classify and dismiss, writing supplementary observations no one read, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel in the company of any Vethka. Recognition. No one read mine either, Cole said. I wrote 11 field reports about command-class tactical patterns. They got filed under anecdotal. Something moved through Owen's filament antlers. Cole couldn't read it precisely, but the quality of it felt like rueful acknowledgement. We are alike in some ways, Owen said. More than your people think, Cole said. Dawn came in through the ship's observation ports as pale gray, and then copper, and then, as the sun cleared the plateau edge, a hard blazing gold that lit the dust in the air and turned it into something almost beautiful. Sarath had been quiet for a while. She sat across from Cole with her filament antlers at rest and her pale gold eyes half-focused, the way of someone thinking past the conversation into what came after. The record I'm building, she finally said. It needs to reach the inner meridian, not through the official submission channels, which take a year and are reviewed by the same assessment corps that built the original model. It needs to reach a decision-maker who has the authority to order a comprehensive reassessment. How does it get there? Cole asked. I transmit it directly from this vessel. The emissary channel is theoretically secured, but there is a specific contact at the inner court who I trust to receive it and act on it. She paused. Theoretically. Is that the one risk in the plan? Cole asked. No, she said. The risk in the plan is that I am an emissary with 3 years of ignored reports and the political capital of someone who has been correct so often that people have become suspicious of me. My contact is sympathetic but not powerful. This record, she gestured at the logging system, is good. It is detailed and documented, and it includes behavioral evidence that directly contradicts the assessment baseline. But it is the kind of evidence that, in a court environment, needs to be experienced, not just reviewed. Cole thought about this. He thought about what it meant to need something to be witnessed, to be seen rather than reported. You want to transmit live, he said. Sarath looked at him steadily. "You want to broadcast this," he said, "not to your contact, to the court. To whoever is watching the emissary channel when I open it," she said. "In a court environment, presence confers authority that documentation cannot. If I transmit this as a live testimony, if the court watches a human who fought a Vethka patrol and killed a command-class unit single-handed sit in my observation cabin and explain how he did it, the data becomes real in a way that a report cannot make it real." Cole sat for a moment with the weight of this. Live, broadcast. This conversation, this record, being watched in real time by the people who made the decisions that had made 11 months of this war, that had made Firebase Kessler. He thought about his unit's original mandate: documentation. Observe and document Vethka tactical behavior. He'd spent 11 months treating that mandate as an obstacle to what he believed was the real work. Now he looked at it from the other side and saw it differently. The observation had always been the real work. He'd just been observing the wrong things. "What happens if it works?" he asked. "A formal reassessment," Sarath said, "which means 6 to 18 months of process during which nothing immediately changes. But at the end of it, the compliance framework is rebuilt on an accurate model of human capacity, which means the imperial strategy in this theater is rebuilt on an accurate model, which means they stop treating this like a pacification operation," Cole said. "Yes. And if it doesn't work, then you are in the custody of an imperial emissary vessel, and your situation is not enviable, though I would do what I could." Cole looked at her. He looked at Owen, who had not moved from his place at her shoulder, but who was watching Cole with an expression that Cole had learned, over 3 hours, to read. It was the expression of someone who had already decided where they stood and were waiting to see if the other person had the sense to stand there too. He thought about Sergeant Mace. He thought about Captain Flores, coming back from the compliance camp with her door off its hinges eyes. He thought about the thing Flores had said to him 2 days before she shipped home, when she'd called him into her office and told him that the war they were fighting was real and necessary, and also that it was being fought wrong, and that she'd been wrong about which part of her job was the important part for 6 years, and now she knew better, and he should know better sooner than she had. "Open the channel," Cole said. The inner court of the third meridian was 11 active emissary lines and 42 passive observation feeds. This was a slow morning in court terms, which meant roughly 300 individuals were present or monitoring. It was into this space that Sarath Vekon opened her transmission, without announcement, without the formal preamble that protocol required, without anything except the direct feed from her observation cabin and her own voice saying, "I have the evidence, watch." She gave Cole the floor. He talked for 2 hours. He didn't prepare remarks. He spoke the way he'd spoken to Sarath over the previous hours, specifically, factually, with the kind of detail that came from having spent 11 months paying very close attention to something. He described engagements. He described learning curves. He described the way the snap cadences worked and how he'd mapped them. And he did this while facing the transmission camera directly, speaking to whoever was on the other end of that line, refusing to be abstract about any of it because abstract was what you were when you needed to keep your audience at a distance. And Cole had decided that the only thing that mattered here was closing the distance. He described Firebase Kessler last. Not the way he described it to Sarath, not the flat tactical account, the real description, the one he'd been carrying for 11 months without putting down, the soldiers he'd known, what the compliance framework had done, what it meant to fight a war where the enemy had decided you were a managed problem rather than a genuine adversary, and what you did with yourself when the people on your own side had made the same decision. Behind the camera, he could see Sarath watching him with her filament antlers very still, and Owen with his hand nowhere near his weapon, and the 4 other guards in postures that Cole had, over 3 hours, learned to read as something between attention and something that had no English equivalent but wasn't far from what humans called respect. When he was done, he sat quietly. The transmission line was open. Whatever the court was doing with what it had just received, he couldn't see it from here. Sarath said, "You understand now that you cannot unknow what you've heard." She was speaking to her court. Cole did not look away from the camera. The formal reassessment was ordered 48 hours later. It was not a quick concession. The court debated, as courts always debated, and there were voices who argued that 1 human in 1 canyon was not sufficient basis for rewriting 6 years of strategic doctrine. But there were also voices who had watched 2 hours of a man speak with absolute specificity about the 47 ways in which the Empire's model of his species was incorrect, and those voices had the weight of evidence behind them, and evidence, in the end, even in courts, carries more than it should have to. Cole was returned to human custody under a formal emissary protocol that the Vethka had never previously used with a human. The document used the word individual rather than asset. It was a small thing. Cole noticed it. The war did not end. Wars of that scope do not end in 48 hours or 18 months, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. The reassessment produced a new framework 6 months later, and the new framework produced new protocols 3 months after that, and those protocols began slowly, unevenly, in the way of all institutional change, to shift the way the Empire engaged in the human theater. Firebase Kessler was not undone. Nothing undoes that kind of thing. But the compliance framework that had produced it was, eventually, dismantled. Cole was debriefed for 11 days when he got back. He answered every question with the same completeness and specificity he'd brought to everything else, and on the 3rd day of the debrief, when a senior intelligence officer asked him how he'd ended up in an Imperial emissary vessel willingly, Cole thought about it for a real moment and then said, "She was watching me fight and she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She wanted to understand it. I figured that was worth something." The intelligence officer wrote it down without comment, which Cole had expected. You couldn't brief what he'd experienced in that cabin into a form that fit a debrief protocol. The debrief protocol was built for a different world. That world was adjusting. He went back eventually. Different assignment, different theater, but the same war at a different angle. He served 4 more years before the formal ceasefire framework produced a state that was close enough to peace that the deployment cycle finally slowed. He saw Sarath once more, at the formal negotiation sessions in Geneva that marked the beginning of the ceasefire process. She was there as part of the Imperial Emissary Corps, and she had been promoted. The political capital she'd lost 3 years of being correct had come back with interest. She was taller in status than she'd been on the plateau, and she carried it the way people carry things they've worked for and not things they were given. She looked at him across a room full of diplomats and soldiers and court functionaries, and made the tilted head gesture she'd learned from a human cultural briefing. He nodded back. They did not speak. They didn't need to. There are people in your life whose entire significance lives in a specific thing that happened at a specific time, and any conversation after that fact is not wrong but also not necessary. They had said what needed to be said in a burning canyon and a ship above a plateau and 2 hours of broadcast that had, eventually, changed the math. He thought about the words she'd told him her people had for him early in that transmission, the one that broadcasts. He'd thought at the time that they'd chosen it because of the live transmission. Later he'd understood they'd coined it when he was still in the canyon, that the Vethka on Sarath's ship, watching his thermal signature move through fire and shadow, had recognized before he did that this was what he was doing, that his whole 11 months had been a broadcast, a signal sent into silence, waiting for someone with the right receiver to tune in. The thing about broadcasts, his brother had told him once, His brother, who died of something medical and ordinary before any of this started, before contact operations or compliance frameworks or burning canyons, was that you never knew who was listening. You just had to keep sending. Guard Captain Oven filed his supplementary observations from the plateau engagement as an appendix to Sarath's reassessment request. This time they were not ignored. They were, in fact, cited 11 times in the final reassessment document, particularly the section dealing with human tactical cognition and what the original assessment core had mistakenly categorized as impulsive behavior. Oven, when asked about it by a junior court analyst who was compiling the reassessment's historical record, said, "I watched him hold still. That was the first thing. A creature that can choose to be still that completely, you should pay attention to what it chooses to do with its motion." The analyst asked him what he meant. Oven was quiet for a moment. "He could have run the whole canyon," he finally said. "He had the speed, the terrain reading. He could have simply run and survived and never changed anything. But he kept stopping, kept thinking, kept choosing to become part of the terrain instead of trying to escape it." He paused again. "That is not how a creature that has given up acts. That is how a creature acts when it knows the outcome is uncertain and has decided the uncertainty is worth engaging." The analyst wrote this down. "Also," Oven added, "he talked to us. That was the second thing. He was alone and outnumbered, and his ammunition was low, and his people were dead in the canyon behind him. And when a strange voice came through his communications frequency, he did not assume it was a trap. He asked a question." The guard captain's filament antlers shifted in what the analyst had learned to identify as reflective. "Do you know how many species we have encountered in all the years of the Empire's expansion? Who asked the question first?" The analyst looked at his records. "I don't have that data." "Neither do I," Oven said, "because there are not enough of them to record." Outside the window of the debriefing room, Geneva spread in its wet autumn colors, the lake flat and steel gray, the mountains beginning to hold snow on their upper faces. It looked like a place that had been many things and was becoming something new, which was, the analyst thought later, not a bad description of where they all were. He filed Oven's testimony under Human Tactical Profile, subcategory Cognitive and Behavioral, and flagged it for the top of the stack. The supplementary observation section of the reassessment final document was 43 pages. It began with a single sentence. "We were watching the wrong thing.